You're watching the 5th Annual Assembly of Planners Symposium, held on February 20, 2020, at the Dusatani, Guam Resort. The symposium's agenda centered on 3 main tracks, on flood control, land use planning, and zero waste, and featured other presentations, including remarks by Governor Lou Leon Guerrero and Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenorio. The symposium was organized by the Bureau of Statistics and Plans Guam Coastal Management Program, with a grant from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. The theme of this year's symposium is Creating a Clear Vision in a Changing Climate. Coming up, this segment will discuss real-life scenarios of flooding issues around the island with a panel of government environmental, engineering, and land use experts.
So the format is going to be, we're going to talk about this hypothetical scenario that's based on real life situations, and then each agency is going to have the opportunity to discuss how legally they are able to address it and prevent it, and then also talk about some long-term solutions about how we can prevent these kinds of scenarios from happening. And I just want to be mindful of the audience too. So in case you have a hard time hearing, or if you needed a little bit of clarification, if you needed the question repeated, go ahead and raise your hand, and somebody from the Guam Coastal Management Program is going to go ahead and come by and take your question. We are going to end the session with questions and answers as well. So if you have a burning question, you're definitely going to be able to do that. Let us run through a typical scenario here on Guam. Well, it is a piece of land. Use your imagination. Okay, this is a piece of land. Okay, and so let's say that this piece of land is owned by a couple. As they are wont to do on Guam, they end up having 4 children, and they decide that they want their children to be able to use this lot, and so they divide it into 4 pieces of property. Okay, so each kid is going to get a piece of the property. Well, over time, each kid has more kids, cousins, people come from the States, they want to visit, they want to stay. So each kid ends up splitting the property into 4 pieces each. And what you can see in the middle, that is an easement, which basically helps to create more access to what was 4 lots before, and which is now 16 lots or 16 pieces of property. Now, what happens? So you begin to see piecemeal development here. So some people decide, okay, I'm going to build my house. Other people decide, I'm going to have a contractor help me develop maybe 1 or 2 or 3 lots at a time, and maybe I'll sell and I'll rent this over time. So as you begin to see development happening, there's been no stormwater infrastructure put into this bigger property, right? So when you have people beginning to develop, some problems begin to present themselves. So when, let's say there's a huge rainstorm, there's a puddle, there's a little bit of ponding at the lowest part of the easement, but for the most part, it's not a huge issue. People acknowledge the puddle. But as you begin to see, there is a little bit more development over time, and you can see that the puddle is now becoming a pond, right? And it's beginning to cause issues with the easement, and it's beginning to actually impede that homeowner there in the middle. And eventually what happens is that what was now 1 lot, or what was 1 lot and became 4 lots and then became 16 lots, each lot now has a house, and there's nowhere for that water to go except in the easement. So you can see now that it's beginning to affect the personal properties, the flooding, and then you are also beginning to, or these homeowners would also begin to experience continuous ponding through the rainy season and potholing in the easement. All right. So here's where things get really exciting. The homeowner in the middle decides that he or she wants to deal with the flooding by putting in a retaining wall and a security fence. So this homeowner goes through the permitting process, okay? And in filling out the permit application, doesn't mention that there's been any kind of flooding historically. The government inspectors go check out the lot. Guess what? It's dry season. So there is no problem that is apparent here. But what happens the first time that it rains, so the homeowner who has the permit, has gone through the permitting process, their retaining wall is doing awesome things for their property, but guess what? The person to the left of this homeowner now has got major issues. So basically every single time it rains, now it's pretty much a flooded property. And this is when we have issues. Okay, so we have this homeowner who's upset. What do you think the homeowner does when he or she gets really upset? What's the first thing you think they do? Call the mayor. And Mayor Jesse, go Queen. I was actually wondering if I posed that question, how many people would respond with call K57? But yeah, it is call the mayor indeed. Okay, so so now, like I said, real life scenario, right? Okay, so the mayor goes to visit the site, kind of gets a sense of what this homeowner is experiencing. In the past, there hadn't been any flooding issues, right? But basically, it had been building up over time with development. In addition, it was really the initiation of this homeowner building that retaining wall and that security fence that really escalated the issue. So basically, the mayor calls in a meeting with the Department of Land Management, Guam Environmental Protection Agency, and also the Department of Public Works. All right, and now we are actually going to talk to representatives from each agency. And we were going to start out with the Department of Public Works, and we'll wait for Dr. Tamori. And so we're going to go ahead and move with Guam EPA.
First, I was advised earlier before I came up here to make sure that everyone knows that I'm not in the U.S. Navy. This is the uniform of the U.S. Public Health Service. That's in the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm assigned to Guam EPA. So just to get that clear, in case you didn't get that from the biography. But to get into the Guam EPA authorities, and as Marie has said, this is a very common scenario. We saw this scenario 3 or 4 times in the last year. We did a very deep dive into the Guam EPA laws and regulations this year to find out exactly what our authorities are. And if you look at our statutory authorities are strictly related to controlling and preventing pollution from affecting people's lives. They do not address flooding. Only with respect to pollution they do, right? So if there's pollution in the flooding, we can control that, but they do not address flooding at all. Move on to the next slide. Mm-hmm. The primary regulation we have, though, that does deal with stormwater is, and everyone's heard about this, is the Soil Erosion and Sediment Control Regulations. So every permit that comes through the building permitting process or the clearing and grading permitting process through Guam DPW must be reviewed and approved by Guam EPA to meet the requirements of these regulations. And what these regulations require is they require erosion control during construction, but they also require what we call a post-construction drainage system plan. So this is the one little bit that we have that touches on flood control. This comes during the project design only, so during permitting only. And it requires that people have plans to address the post-construction runoff, and that includes some flood control aspects. In 2012, Guam EPA adopted, through an executive order, a manual from the CNMI Guam that was put together back in 2006 that put additional requirements on stormwater. But there's some caveats in all of this. So even though we have these requirements and we apply them to every new building permit that comes through our office, the regulations provide exemptions for single-family homes. So in these situations where we have these subdivisions, especially these subdivisions that happen in a piecemeal fashion that were never identified as a subdivision, each of those individual homeowners were never required to put in any of these controls. Typically, homeowners are not required to put in these types of controls because they're very intrusive to the average home, right? You don't put a ponding basin in your yard. It becomes a pond, and then you can't mow it, for example. That's why usually in a larger subdivision, this is taken care of as infrastructure, and then each individual homeowner can build their lot the way they normally would. So as I mentioned, these, in terms of gaps and misconceptions, and that's the way we've structured each of our agencies' responses, one of the biggest gaps that we see in this whole process is that these smaller divisions of land, parceling as they call it, tend to go unnoticed, because until you've got more than 5 lots, it doesn't get triggered as a subdivision, and the requirements that we all have as agencies to put infrastructure requirements into these developments do not apply. And as I just mentioned already, the residential exemptions, they make sense from an individual homeowner point of view, but as you can see from these examples, which are real life, as you get more and more of these homes that build up, the impacts become cumulative, and whoever's living in that low spot gets all that runoff from all these other homes that were built. So over time, it develops into larger problems that were not anticipated when these exemptions were first written. Another large gap that we have at Guam EPA is that our rules, as they're written right now, apply only during this permitting process. There are no provisions in our rules that apply after construction is completed. So even if it weren't homes, if it was a large commercial facility and they were, say, somehow made it through the process, maybe back in the 1980s, and they didn't put in stormwater controls, we have no authority to step in and say, you must go in there now and retrofit and put this in. We have no ability to go in, even when someone's system has failed. We have no legal authority to go in there and say, you must now replace this system or maintain it. The other problem that or the other gap, I guess, and misconception is that our rules apply strictly to erosion control. They do not address flooding. In fact, if you read the definitions section of our regulations, you'll see some definitions in there. I think the definition for stormwater management says, it explicitly says not to be confused with the control of flood impacts. Another misconception that we hear all the time, we have people call us up all the time and say, well, Guam EPA, your regulations require that every property contain all of its runoff on site. That is not actually a requirement of any of our regulations. Our regulations have a lot of very technical provisions. I think some of those technical provisions have been misconstrued in the past to mean that, but that is not what they mean when you do the engineering work. So in this particular case, it'd be a very difficult situation as we've seen. Each one of those homes was built legitimately with a building permit that passed through the entire regulatory system. The single-family residence exemption was applied. They built their homes. If we had known about a flooding problem and they came in for a permit for the retaining wall and the fence, we would have stopped it. But we frequently miss those things because they're very hard to identify in the field. Our staff are usually not out there during a downpour to do their inspections. Even though Guam gets 100 inches of rain a year, on most days you're out there, it's a pretty nice day and there's not flooding happening. But even if we had noticed that, if we were aware of that problem, our regulations don't directly address flooding. So we've questioned ourselves, like if we see that, how do we address that? How do we tell a person, I'm sorry, you can't build a fence because you would flood your neighbors? That's just not something that's in our regulations. There's one more solution there. So after permitting and construction, which is usually when these problems come to us, right? When they go to the mayor, then the mayor comes to us and asks us these questions. That's when we almost have no options left at that point, because the permitting cycle has been completed, construction's been done for many years. If there's no developer to site, which is the case in many of these subdivisions that have sprouted up kind of organically, the piecemeal process, there's nobody even to site in these cases. And as I mentioned before, our regulations don't apply retroactively, so even if we did have a developer to site, it'd be very difficult for us to step in and say, you must now do something.
Thank you, Commander Bearden. Okay, and now we're going to go on and talk about how the Department of Land Management would respond to the situation, and Mr. Paul Santos and Ms. Celine Cruz can respond to this.
Good morning, my name is Paul Santos. I'm a surveyor, I'm not a planner, I'm not an ED-man. But the first thing that comes when a developer comes in or a homeowner is to approve a map. And so oftentimes we don't see these things, we don't see the problems because we're focusing on the map itself. This is where the problem stems. And so in regards to the statutes and regulations, I'll defer to the planner.
Thank you, Paul. So when we looked at this scenario, we had to look at all of our statutes and regulations that address flooding. And we're at the forefront of this whole issue because it starts with the parceling. Many times parceling under 5 lots doesn't require land use commission approval. And with that land use commission approval, there comes the requirements, basic requirements to address stormwater, putting in roads, and bringing in the infrastructure to a subdivision. But because it falls below that 5-lot parceling, we see these issues, right? And again, it's from these piecemeal construction of residential homes where you start to realize that if there was any, if there even wasn't any flooding issue before the development of those lots, the water has to go somewhere, and it's going to go to the lowest point of that area. And maybe before all of that, where you didn't have as many impervious surfaces, the land could just absorb all of this rain runoff. But after the development, then it generally tends to go to the lowest point. So in all of this, our statutes, when we look at maps coming through, we focus on land use. So if you came in with a proposed subdivision of 4 lots and it meets all the requirements, then we just have to go forward and make sure that it just meets those requirements. But there are general requirements in subdivisions to reasonably protect against flooding. So in that respect, regarding public rights of ways, if you start to notice flooding over the course of time, even as an individual property owner, you wouldn't be able to go out and just address it on your own. You would have to have explicit permission from the Department of Public Works for any construction or any type of mitigation that you see might help, with the flooding situation. If you came in to our office with a proposed subdivision of more than 5 lots, it triggers so many things. It triggers a developer to put in some basic infrastructure. They would have to show the contour of the property so that they're creating a ponding basin or whatever means to channel the water to an area where it's not going to cause any problems for the subdivision. But without that, again, if you're going below the 5-lot parceling, you wouldn't have to put in that basic infrastructure to address all of those flooding issues.
Okay.
I just want to re-emphasize that there's got to be a distinction made between a lot parceling and a subdivision survey. By definition, a subdivision is composed of 6 or more lots. And automatically, when you see a subdivision map coming in, it has to go through the Guam Land Use Commission approval process, which means, as Celine pointed out, that the commission will look at the storm drain characteristics, the topography, the infrastructure, etc. However, the 5-lot is reviewed solely by the chief planner or the division of planning and the chief surveyor, division of surveying. And that's where the problem lies. If you go back to that slide that you had earlier where you had 4 lots and then it evolved into 16, that's where the problem comes in, because one map will come in showing 4 lots, and then 6 months down the road another map comes in showing another 4 lots, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, we do not review topography, we do not review infrastructure requirements. We just look at the pretty picture. We make sure that it meets all the survey requirements and all the zoning requirements, and that's it. And upon development, upon building of the residential dwellings, we have no control of the infrastructure. That's where the myth comes in that everything has to be controlled within that area.
So our gaps and misconceptions are that although we are the applicators of the zoning code, the enforcement lies with the Department of Public Works. So a lot of issues where parental subdivisions are not required to make improvements for storm drainage, where residential exemptions for single family and duplexes do not require those same infrastructure improvements, and they don't address post-construction runoff. And then there are impacts from prior developments into new construction that affect what's going on out there. Sorry. And our solutions would be generally during the permitting and construction phase to just try to look at the topography, look at contour maps. Those are all we really have available to kind of get a gauge of what's going to be happening if that construction is permitted. And if it is, you know, a single family home is permitted in all of the zones on Guam except for a school zone and a public facility zone. So we would just look at those and maybe alert the residential homeowner that, you know, there could be some issues down the road. And then if there's any historical flooding that we're aware of, we could bring it to their attention. And then after permitting and construction, again, our enforcement lies with the Department of Public Works for any zoning violations.
The Survey Division has communicated their concerns about including topography in a survey map. However, there's been some, you know, slight pushback. And of course, the pushback is the cost. Who's going to pay for the extra effort to bring in the topographic features? Right now, there's a requirement to bring in the planimetric features like as-built, but there's nothing in the law that says that we have to bring in topography. And, you know, doing a topo map is an expensive endeavor, and that must be passed on to the client. And so we're slowly talking to them about it. At this point in time, we can just ask them, but and expect some pushback. Some surveyors will do it, some won't.
Mr. Masuto Tamori from the Department of Public Works is here. So glad that you could make it.
Basically, our legal authority at Department of Public Works is primarily preventative and the flood prevention and controls to establish prior to development of a subdivision. So, for example, if that 5-lot subdivision example came across, we won't even get to see it. It will go directly to the Department of Land Management. Government of Guam agencies to vet subdivision plans to ensure sufficient infrastructure for development, including storm drainage. These are our basic legal authorities. The infrastructure requirements and stringent plan review do not apply for lots such as what I just mentioned, 5 lots or less, or parental subdivision. Building permits are not required for construction of fences. This could be concrete fences, basically walls around a building could be considered a concrete fence that does not require a permit to construct, as long as it's not a retaining wall that retains soil materials and so on. For change of grade, anybody can go up to, I believe, 6 feet high and build a wall around. A concrete fence may disrupt the natural flow of storm water, causing flooding issues. May not necessarily be for your lot, but could create it for the neighboring lots. So DPW does not have the authority to force private property owners to do anything post-construction related remediation. As far as solutions are concerned, I think community outreach and education would basically provide that prevention that we really need. Promote low-impact developments and green infrastructure, reduction of impervious surfaces. I often past 30 years I've been on Guam, recently come across some, what I can call, for lack of better terms, flash floods, and those are some perhaps caused by having more and more impervious surfaces, but it also could be related to some level of climate change. Storm drain runoff and disposal system, post-construction, open additional ponding and percolation basin, that would be a solution. In this case, all rights that the Department of legal rights that Department of Public Works has is to place such disposal systems within our rights-of-ways. So additional ponding basin, percolation basin in those areas, install additional flood controls within the right-of-way. This could be in forms of below-grade perforated pipe system. These are usually involving like filter fabric and drain rocks and so on. Or alternatively, like a few designs that I personally was involved in, one, let's say, at duty-free shoppers, where the bus parking area is, one at First Hawaiian Bank in Tamuning. Those are the type of, you can call them below-grade vaults, that they are concrete in nature, structural walls, and structural slab where cars drive over are the means of disposing and therefore recharging the groundwater in that manner. Now, none of these are really easy and possible further south due to the geology that we experience. As you have noticed, we don't have rivers up north because of the geology, and we don't have huge flooding issues usually up north, but we do have them down south. Currently, without any proper funding available for construction of such disposal systems, our hands are tight. If there are monies available, we can probably solve the area where we are in Tumon, which is a low-lying area with similar systems, instead of having standing water or tasking one or two percolation basins that at most they are operating under tidal condition. If the tide is high, you're not having much movement, and when the tide is low, maybe you'll have some movement through these, for example, Fujita ponding basin. Develop and implement stormwater utility. Funding is therefore important. We are also considering, through public education and through developing some interest with community that is utilizing these roadways, and if we do allow for the water to come into the roads, have some sort of a fee-based funding source which is dedicated specifically for stormwater management purposes. We were just hit by this basically, and it's a great thing in my opinion to improve the quality of all of our outfalls that basically run into the ocean throughout the runoff and the storm drains, the pipes, catch basins, manholes, along main routed roads such as Marine Drive. I think we have numerous outfalls that directly enter into the ocean. So the program being called MS4 is the municipal separate storm system. So we already have about 2,000 plus stormwater utilities that are implemented in 39 states within the US, including Honolulu, I believe. And they are, considering, or they are already having a fee-based funding for their dedicated stormwater management purposes. These are some of the issues that DPW are basically dealing with these days. Thank you.
So we're just going to go ahead and do a summary here. So for all of the 3 agencies who are represented, you can tell that there are some major gaps here, and the major gaps are that there are subdivision requirements, and so they don't apply in this scenario because basically you have individual homeowners who are beginning to build their lots, develop their lots, or maybe they're using a contractor for maybe 2 or 3. But it seems to me that the number is 5 or less, and that's really, if there had been a subdivision, a technical subdivision that had 5 or more lots, then there would be this requirement in place to put in stormwater infrastructure, right? The other thing is that the other major gap is that there's minimal development requirements for individual homeowners, and again, that comes to the number 5 is the magic number. As we can also tell from all of these presentations, there's little to no ability to address post-construction problems. So primarily, these agencies get involved in permitting. They're in preventative work, and they can't really do anything if there's an issue because they just don't have the enforcement authority to do it, and or they don't have the necessary funds. Okay? And then as far as another gap, flooding is not explicitly addressed by any one agency. So I think that that's also sort of an interesting, I think that's interesting. Do any one of you want to comment on these major gaps as you see them?
I'd like to just add, just to maybe clarify for everybody, this presentation today and our summary of gaps and solutions is coming about as a result. We're actually a subcommittee of what's called the Guam Silver Jackets, which was started about a year ago, I believe, by this administration, and it's a flood control interagency stakeholder working group. And we've all been working together for the past several months to try to identify these, and this is kind of sort of a report out from our subcommittee, I guess you'd say. And with that, I'd like to just maybe have you go on and finish our sub-report,
Okay.
our subcommittee report.
All right, so we do want to talk about some policy options, and I do want to take care that these are policy options. These are not necessarily recommendations from every agency, right? So we're going to put some policy options out here for anybody who's a policymaker, people who are interested in regulatory functions. These are options. We understand that sometimes there's not political will. We understand that sometimes there's not the actual financial mechanisms in place to implement these. But as far as flood prevention is concerned, some of the policy options could include decreasing development density, okay? It could also mean potentially setting an impervious surface percentage per lot. It could mean incentivizing low-impact development standards. Some other options could be establishing design criteria for retaining walls, fences to allow flow-through. Some other flood prevention options would include clearly designating flood control agencies. I put DPW with a question mark because I think that that's something that obviously each agency would need to consider in terms of their responsibility, their attribution. I don't know if you want to take that on. Also potentially using mapping to indicate potential drainage problems in areas, so basically the use of better data. And this other process here too that I also saw was developing a process by which individual homeowners undergo Department of Land Management review. DPW has the possibility to do a technical review on all parcels to include these kinds of technical requirements, so percolation rates and topography. Okay, So as far as floods that are causing post-development, some of the options would include changing rules to retroactively address existing development. So this could mean maintenance or replacement. This could mean installation, if there's none, for stormwater infrastructure. And then Department of Public Works has recommended this, and I think that this is sort of a really interesting kind of moonshot, as you were, sort of systematic change, and that would basically be to make stormwater utility, to develop a stormwater utility. And basically what happens is that you would develop a funding mechanism by which you can actually maintain stormwater infrastructure. And I know that we can have a much larger conversation about that. Do any of you wanted to jump in on that? We're also going to open this up for questions as well, because I think some of these are certainly some intense policy options here, and I think it's worth having a discussion about that, and we've definitely left room to do that. Do either one of you want to talk a little bit more about any of these in particular?
I just want to clarify the trigger there, the 6-lot or the subdivision. There are also a lot of maps that come in under what is called the decedent's estate. What happens here is the court orders a subdivision of, say, 10 lots. Notwithstanding the topography, the fact that it's substandard, so long as the court approves that, then we have no choice but to approve that map. That map will then become a footprint for the owner or the heirs to develop upon.
Okay, so can we go ahead and open it up for questions? Great, all right. We already have 2-3 hands, and Jathan is going to come around.
I want to state for the record, though, that the policy that exists today has been developed over time. And by the way, my name is Marcel Camacho. I don't believe, though, that the information provided here today reflects the complete picture. You're comparing apples and oranges. You're talking about parceling, which mostly relates to residential development, and there's a rhyme and reason for that, to try to ensure that we who live here have the opportunity to develop residences for ourselves, our children, so on and so forth. And there are other rules, regulations, policy that dictate the size of the lot. The percolation rate could be determined to find out whether the water can actually go into the ground. And you know, that all helps with the stormwater management, right? To say now that larger subdivisions of 6 or more, if someone wanted to develop, have to maintain the stormwater management, that's okay. There are curbs and gutters and sidewalks and ponding basins and things of that sort that go into those larger scale developments that can mitigate stormwater management. So, Masood, you talked about low impact development. A single house on a 100 by 100 lot is low impact. Less impervious surface, I think there exists laws right now that dictate the buildable area on a lot and how much impervious surface you can develop on each lot. And why does that exist? Again, to allow the water to percolate into the ground and be absorbed by, or to absorb the stormwater management. There could be percolation tests because, you know, in different parts of the island, you have clayish soil versus limestone. And in the case of limestone, the water can percolate faster. So if the system isn't broke, don't try to fix it. That's my sense. And I'm not really sure that you guys have talked to each other completely and figured out that what exists today really needs to be fixed. We have the senators here, and I'm a former senator, and I have to look at both sides. I have to look at what is fair, and from a development standpoint, it does cost money to take away lots in a situation where EPA or the government entities want to manage stormwater, and if it's not necessary, again, it's a cost to the developer that really doesn't need to exist. And I hope the mayor, you're not going to contradict me, but even if you do, I mean, we all look out for the better interests of the community, but also we want to make sure that we don't over-legislate. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your comment. Do any of the panelists here, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I'd like to mention one particular item. I appreciate the former senator indicating that the percolation rate, if taken on that particular site, which is 100 foot by 100 foot, roughly quarter acre lot we're talking about, and would the legislature or would the property owner be, I guess, conducive to the fact that if you're in a village, let's say you're in Santa Rita and you have a quarter acre lot, and basically you're not getting the percolation rate that you would like to have, then where are we with that? If it's not going to percolate, then you're basically going to have to send your water. And not only that, but if there is no wastewater system available, you're going to have to try to leach, having a septic tank and leach on your 100 foot by 100 foot site. If percolation rate is a determining factor, I'm all for it, but is the population of Guam prepared to go based on that? That's the question, in my opinion.
Just one more comment, because again, the size of the lot is dictated by the zone. And in an agricultural zone, it may be even larger than 100 by 100 because you need the septic tank and the leaching field. And in that case, again, based on the soil or the substrate, it could be that the percolation rate is adequate. And we assume that the existing policy is such that it takes into account all of that, the lot size, the soil and substrate, and the percolation rate in determining whether, and the stormwater management, whether it's suitable, again, to absorb the amount of rainfall or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you again. I think we had 2 other comments. Mayor?
Yes, thank you. For those of you who don't know who I am, I think I am the only mayor here. I'm Mayor Gogui, and Marcel just happens to be a member of my municipal planning council. So, you know, development is a concern. It's not just a concern, I think, in my village. I believe it's a concern in all villages. And I'm just surprised, somewhat surprised, that I don't have more of my colleagues here. But for us, in Order Chalampago, not only did I feel compelled to attend, but I asked as many of my MPC members that had the time to attend this conference. And I appreciate them being here. I have 4 of them out of 10. But, you know, I'm glad Paul had mentioned subdivisions. And he had mentioned the comment, or he made a comment about estate subdivisions that are sometimes forced upon them by the courts. But when we take a look at the subdivision law or the zoning law, I believe that's for planned development, basically. And my concern in some of the problem areas that we've had in our village aren't these subdivisions per se, but in fact, parental subdivisions, which basically is an estate, not necessarily decedent, but an estate that's being subdivided by a parent, a parental subdivision, where they're required, they're allowed to subdivide their properties, and they're required not to sell any of those lots inside those subdivisions. That those parental subdivisions has a little bit more latitude when they subdivide and doesn't require the same kind of reviews in these development subdivisions that would otherwise be looked at. For example, easement access. It's my understanding in a parental subdivision, they're only required to set aside a 20-foot easement versus a 40-foot easement in these parental subdivisions. And that these parental subdivisions can in fact be greater than 5 lots without the GLUC's review. And depending on the topography, you know, that I've seen in some of these parental subdivisions, they oftentimes put easements in the most untenable part of the land. And then once their kids or whoever, or 5 years after they subdivide, they sell the lots. And then these new lot owners want to develop. They come to the government and says, hey, we need these easements open up because we want to build. And they may not even be a relative of the original subdivider of this parental subdivision. And that's where I find most of the problems occurring, at least in my villages, these pre-existing parental subdivisions with 20-foot easements, easements being in the most untenable part of the property. And I believe the government has gotten to a point where we have access to tools that allows us to take a look at these parental subdivisions and determine whether or not they make sense. And it was my understanding that the government of Guam, with their access to the LiDAR mapping of the island, even though it's not as accurate as we'd like it to be, when a topo is actually a requirement upon a property owner who's subdividing their property, that these LiDAR maps at least gives us a general idea whether or not these parental subdivisions may in fact be tenable, or it just doesn't make sense. But we kind of don't look at that and go ahead and prove these one-dimension maps versus taking a look at least the two-dimensional, the 2 dimensions that we really need to pay attention to on whether or not these subdivisions make sense before we approve these maps. So any comments about these parental subdivisions and how we can try to correct the problem, that gap that we find occurring?
I'm glad you brought that up. The Department of Land Management definitely has a response to this.
Before I give this to Department of Land Management, I agree with you 100%. If it's going to be all about putting a flat piece of paper and try to make exact areas out of the bigger lot, the parental, whether it's a 5 lot or what have you, without the benefit of the topography, and develop some of the right-of-ways or access roads that these subdivisions do require, then we basically risk the fact that for folks who are a little older, like I am in this room, you may recall EHA subdivision. And if you look at it from the standpoint that there were roads placed on the map that absolutely not accessible, not for a lot of the lots, even if you are driving a 4-wheel drive vehicle, you couldn't get to your lot. So, like you said, what is the value of subdividing when you cannot even access your lot? That's very important, and I do emphasize that as a minimum, the topography should be taken into account, where sometimes, unfortunately, you know, it's not. And I'll give the mic to Senor Santos here.
The mayor is absolutely correct. Decedents' estates and parental divisions are in the same category. And what prompted this discussion, in fact, was when EPA talked about parental divisions in flood zones. And so what our division did was overlaid the parental division surveys that we have gathered over the years in the GIS and overlaid it on the firm maps. What we found is that there's not a significant impact on the flood zone. However, flooding, local flooding as EPA and DPW terms it, is the problem. And you are absolutely correct that the 20-foot right-of-way is inadequate. Maybe some of the senators here might chime in on that and decide to change the law. Right now, the law allows for a minimum of 20 feet. And we're beginning to find that was okay then, maybe 20, 30 years ago, but now it's quite inadequate with the installation of infrastructure and power and water, et cetera.
And then I just kind of wanted to go back to that, you know, we have regulations in place. A lot of what Mr. Camacho said earlier, really, we do have regulations in place. And what the gaps that we're all seeing is, even with those regulations in place, these things are still happening. I also want to clarify that the discussion was about not developers and developments of large subdivisions, but of individual property owners constructing their single-family homes on properties maybe given to them by their parents, or maybe they made an investment. But that construction of single-family homes throughout the areas, it does cause problems. And what we tried to look at was where within our authorities we could find solutions.
And I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
I just want, sorry, just real quick, just want to add too that,
patience.
as speaking for our subcommittee from the Silver Jackets, we threw out every possible possibility. Those are not necessarily recommendations. We know that some of those are very untenable, that they would not be possible to do politically. And the reason we did that was because we want people to look at every single possible alternative and realize that by getting ourselves into this situation where we have these existing flood control problems, that really boil down to the only real option being left is to install infrastructure. This becomes an infrastructure problem, which then means, you know, major capital improvement type project that we don't have the funding for. And this is something we want to get out there. So the alternative to that is to try to prevent these in the first place. But we do have areas where it's too late, and there will be no other alternative but infrastructure.
Thanks. Okay.
So I wanted to start by saying I think Celine was right on about the question about the stormwater management systems and plans and policies. So going back to the recommendations that were shown on the screen, you started out with density, but I want to point out that smart growth planning and master planning processes address density in a very different way. The requirements for R2 family housing on a property demand that stormwater systems have to be put in. Those conditions don't exist for single-family detached individual properties. We worked on a project recently where a large parcel could have been gradually parceled out into single-family lots and not ever had to contend with the requirement for stormwater management systems. So I think that you have to be careful when you just put density on the screen to say stormwater management plans related to the density of a site. Because changing the density and allowing for fewer homes on a parcel does nothing to improve the chances that stormwater will be properly handled. Stormwater, if you take the example of gradual parceling for 25 or 50 parcels, that's 25 or 50 driveways, 25 or 50 roofs, 25 or 50 roads leading in and out of those parcels. Whereas if you did a R2 multifamily housing, you got a road that can go in and out to the site. They're sharing parking. They're sharing a roof. So the ability to maintain open space on a property and using density as a catalyst for R2 makes more sense. So the discussion of just density needs to be expanded so that it's the whole picture of what density can and cannot do. And one other comment, I guess I was brainwashed 35 years ago, Commander Bearden, when you said There's no requirement to maintain stormwater on a parcel. I just, for 35 years, I thought there was.
It's in the regulations.
Oh, you want to use the mic? You want to use the microphone?
That's the way the regulations are written.
No, thanks-
we went
thanks for
through
the
them many,
clarifying
many
comment.
times.
Sorry, could you hear Commander Bearden what his response was? Okay.
Just one more comment.
I'm sorry. So I'm now wearing my GWA hat, and I'm here with the GWA planners. And as we're looking at this, we would like to offer as a thought, and perhaps something that, if this is something we would like to proceed, that we should really talk to the CCU and GWA management, is that GWA is entering into this new master plan where we're going to be replacing all of our sewer lines. And so instead of us abandoning those lines, perhaps we could consider using, we can't do combined, so we're not going to allow stormwater into our system. We'll have two lines, an abandoned line and the line that we are going to be creating or installing, and perhaps maybe we sit down together as a community and decide that maybe all these abandoned lines we can convert to stormwater. And so maybe that's we talked about the solution is really in the infrastructure, and maybe this is a solution for that. It will reduce the cost, and perhaps this is something we could discuss with
Thanks.
our management.
And I'm really glad you bring that up, because we can continue discussing at the break that we're a little bit overdue for. At this moment, though, I would really like for our panelists to be able to take the opportunity to thank the people who have helped them in terms of research for today's scenario, and also just in the preparation. So you want to talk about the people at DPW who specifically helped you prepare for today? Or Guam EPA?
Yeah, I just like to thank Kristen Finney, our Assistant Attorney General, who works in our office. She was very instrumental in helping the subcommittee as a whole with researching and putting together this information.
I'd like to thank the Division of Survey, Land Management, and the Planning Division, my partner here, the Chief Planner.
Again, the same team back at Land Management. Thank you.
And I really want to say too, I've actually learned quite a bit over the past couple of weeks in working with the panelists here, and I've really enjoyed talking about stormwater, which is not something that I would have thought that I would say. Anyway, I know that we're long overdue for our break. I really thank you again for your time. I would look forward to talking with you, and hopefully we're going to continue these kinds of conversations. Policymakers are here, so let's talk about more policy options. Thanks again.
Coming up, this segment will feature a workshop to discuss decision support tools, digital coast, and coastal issues.